Most of the time, it feels like you're the one thinking, like your thoughts belong to you, like you're choosing them, guiding them, deciding what to focus on. But if you look closely at how thoughts actually appear, something doesn't quite match that idea. A thought doesn't wait for your permission. It doesn't ask to be created. It simply shows up. One moment it isn't there, and the next moment it is, fully formed, already carrying meaning, already pulling your attention toward it. You don't decide the exact thought that appears next. You don't choose its timing, its tone, or its direction. It arrives on its own, and only after it appears do you begin interacting with it, and that raises a question that's difficult to ignore. If you're not choosing the thought before it appears, then what exactly are you controlling? Because it doesn't feel random, it feels personal, it feels like something that belongs to you. But the way it shows up suggests something else entirely. It suggests that your thoughts might not be something you actively create, but something you experience as they happen. Your brain is constantly generating activity in the background. Patterns, associations, memories, predictions, fragments of language, pieces of past experiences. All of this is happening without your awareness most of the time, forming the basis of what eventually becomes a thought. When one of those patterns reaches a certain level of activation, it enters your awareness. And when it does, it feels like something you just thought. But the process that created it was already happening before you noticed it. This is why thoughts can feel sudden, because from your perspective they are. You only experience the moment they become conscious. You don't experience the build-up that led to them. So it feels like you created the thought in that moment. But in reality, your brain had already been working on it before you became aware of it. And that gap between creation and awareness is where the illusion of control begins. Even when you try to control your thinking, what you're really doing is influencing it after it has already started. You can redirect attention, shift focus, or decide not to follow a thought, but you can't stop the next thought from appearing. Try to predict your next thought before it happens. Not in a general way, but specifically. What exact words will appear? What image? What idea? You can't know, because it hasn't formed yet at the level of awareness you can access. And when it does appear, it feels like it came from you. But you didn't consciously assemble it piece by piece. It arrived as a complete unit. This is what makes it so convincing. The thought feels like it belongs to you because it appears inside your own mind. But the process that created it operates outside of your direct control. And once you notice that, the experience of thinking begins to feel different. The sense of control comes from what happens after the thought appears. You respond to it. You follow it, analyze it, expand it, or push it away. And that response creates the feeling that you're in charge of the process. But that control is partial. It exists in how you engage with thoughts, not in how they are generated. And because the generation happens first, it shapes everything that follows. If a thought appears with strong emotion, your response will be influenced by that emotion. If it appears with urgency, it will feel important immediately, and by the time you're aware of it, it has already set the tone. So your control begins after the most important part has already happened, after the thought has formed, after it has entered your awareness, after it has already influenced your state. And that's why it can feel like your mind is moving on its own, even when you're trying to guide it. What makes this even more convincing is that your brain is constantly trying to create a sense of continuity. It doesn't want your experience to feel fragmented or random. So when thoughts appear, it connects them to a narrative. It links them to what you were just thinking, what you remember, or what you expect. That connection creates the feeling that you are the one generating the thought, because it fits into a sequence. It feels like it came from the previous thought, like it belongs in a chain that you're following. But that chain is also being constructed automatically. Your brain is filling in the gaps, creating links, building a sense of flow. And because it feels continuous, it feels intentional. This is why thinking feels like something you're doing, because your brain is presenting it as a connected process. But underneath that connection, each thought is still being generated in the same way. It appears first, and only then do you experience it. So the sense of control isn't coming from the creation of thoughts, it's coming from how seamlessly your brain connects them after they appear. There's also a deeper layer tied to identity. Thoughts don't just appear as neutral information. They often feel like they say something about you, about what you believe, what you fear, what you want, how you see the world. And because of that, they feel personal. When a thought feels personal, it's much harder to question where it came from. It feels like it must belong to you, like it reflects something real about who you are. And that strengthens the illusion that you're the one producing it. But thoughts don't always reflect truth. They reflect patterns. They reflect what your brain has learned, what it has repeated, what it has stored and connected over time. And those patterns can produce thoughts that feel completely convincing, even when they don't accurately represent you. This is why certain thoughts can feel so powerful, not because they are true, but because they are interpreted as personal. And once that happens, it becomes much harder to step back and see them as something your brain is generating, rather than something you are choosing. Another factor is how quickly your brain moves from a single thought to a chain of thinking. One thought appears, and almost immediately it leads to another. That second thought connects to a third, and within seconds you're inside a sequence that feels continuous and directed, but that sequence isn't being consciously planned. It's being generated through associations. Your brain is linking ideas based on similarity, relevance, emotion, or past experience, and it does this automatically, without requiring your awareness. Because the chain feels smooth, it feels intentional. It feels like you are guiding it from one step to the next. But in reality, each step is being triggered by the one before it, following patterns your brain has already learned. This is why it can feel like your thoughts are moving on their own. Because in a way they are. They are following pathways that have been built over time, connecting ideas in ways that feel natural, even though you are not consciously directing each step. What makes this difficult to notice is how familiar it feels. You've experienced thinking this way for so long that it feels like the default. You don't question how thoughts appear, because they've always appeared this way. But familiarity doesn't equal control. It only makes something feel normal, and when something feels normal, it's easy to assume that you are the one responsible for it. In reality, your brain is running a process that has been refined over time. It generates thoughts based on patterns, connects them into sequences, and presents them in a way that feels continuous and personal. And because you only experience the final result, it feels like something you are doing. But if you look closely, the process is happening before you become aware of it. And that's where the difference lies, between experiencing a thought and creating it. If you slow the process down and observe it carefully, you can start to see the sequence more clearly. A thought appears, and almost instantly there's a reaction. That reaction might be subtle, like a shift in attention, or stronger, like an emotional response, but it happens quickly, before you have time to evaluate it. And that reaction is what gives the thought its sense of importance. It marks it as something worth engaging with, so you follow it, you continue it, you build on it. And in doing so, you strengthen the impression that this is something you are actively thinking. But the key detail is that the reaction follows the thought. It doesn't create it. The thought arrives first, already formed, already carrying enough structure to trigger a response. Once you see that clearly, the dynamic shifts. Because it shows that your role is not in producing the thought, but in responding to it. And that response is where your sense of control actually exists, even though it often feels like it started earlier. Your brain also operates on prediction. It is constantly anticipating what might come next based on patterns it has learned. And this predictive process influences the kinds of thoughts that appear in your awareness. If certain thoughts are being repeated often, or followed with attention, your brain becomes more likely to generate similar ones. Not because you are choosing them, but because the underlying patterns have been reinforced. This makes it feel like your thoughts are consistent with who you are, like they reflect your identity. But in many cases they reflect repetition more than anything else. They are shaped by what has been practiced, not necessarily by what is true or intentional. So when a familiar thought appears, it feels like something you produced. but it's often the result of a predictive system doing exactly what it has been trained to do. And that system operates continuously, whether you are aware of it or not. There is also a timing element that reinforces this illusion. The gap between a thought forming and you becoming aware of it is so small that it feels like a single event. You don't experience the stages separately. You experience the final result. Because of that, it feels like the thought originated at the moment you became aware of it. It feels like it came directly from you in real time. But the process that created it had already been unfolding just before that moment. That tiny gap is enough to change how the experience feels. If you could observe the build-up, the associations forming, the patterns activating, it would feel very different. But you don't have access to that part of the process. So your mind presents the thought as complete, immediate, and personal. And that presentation is what creates the sense of authorship, even though the creation itself happened outside of your awareness. As this becomes clearer, it changes how you interpret your own thinking. Thoughts no longer feel like deliberate actions. They feel more like events, something that appears, something that can be noticed, something that can be responded to, but not something you directly initiate. And that distinction is subtle, but important, because it separates the appearance of thoughts from your response to them. It shows that your involvement begins after the thought has already entered your awareness. From there, you can choose to follow it, question it, ignore it, or let it pass. But that choice happens after the thought exists, not before. And recognizing that difference begins to shift the sense of control, not by increasing it over thought creation, but by clarifying where it actually exists, not in what appears, but in what you do next. One of the reasons this is so difficult to notice is because your brain is constantly reinforcing the sense that you are the source of your thoughts. It presents them in your own internal voice, using familiar language, familiar tone, familiar patterns. So when they appear, they feel like something you are saying to yourself. That familiarity creates ownership. It makes the thought feel like it belongs to you, like it represents something you intentionally produced, but the familiarity is part of the presentation, not the origin. Your brain is using patterns it has learned to construct something that feels recognizable, and because it feels recognizable, it feels like it came from you. But the process that generated it is still happening automatically outside of your direct control. This is what makes the illusion so strong. The thought doesn't feel foreign. It feels like it's yours. And because of that, it's rarely questioned at the level of how it was created. It's accepted immediately, simply because it feels familiar. There is also a tendency to merge the content of a thought with your sense of self. When a thought appears, especially one that carries emotion or meaning, it can feel like it reflects something about you, about your beliefs, your intentions, your identity, and that connection makes it harder to see the thought as something separate. It feels like something you are expressing rather than something you are observing. And once that happens, the idea that you are not fully in control of your thoughts becomes even more difficult to accept, because if the thought feels like part of you, then questioning its origin can feel like questioning yourself. And your brain resists that. It prefers consistency. It prefers to maintain a stable sense of identity. So it continues to present thoughts in a way that feels personal, even though the process that creates them is automatic. And that keeps the illusion intact. Another layer comes from how quickly your brain assigns meaning to thoughts. The moment a thought appears, it is interpreted. It is given context, significance, and direction almost instantly, and that interpretation shapes how you respond to it. But that interpretation is also automatic. It is based on past experiences, learned patterns, and emotional associations. It is not something you consciously choose in the moment. So by the time you are aware of the thought, it has already been interpreted in a certain way. It already carries a meaning that influences how it feels and how you react to it. This makes it seem like the thought arrived with that meaning built in, like it was always intended to be understood that way. But in reality, the meaning was assigned as part of the same automatic process that generated the thought itself. And because both happen so quickly, they feel like a single event. What begins to shift this experience is recognizing that thoughts can be observed without being followed, that they can appear without requiring a response, and that distinction separates the generation of thoughts from your involvement with them. When a thought appears and you don't immediately engage with it, something different happens. The thought doesn't expand in the same way. It doesn't develop into a chain. It remains at the level it first appeared, and then it begins to fade. That shows something important. That the continuation of a thought depends on your engagement with it, not its initial appearance, but what happens after. And that is where your influence actually exists, not in stopping thoughts from appearing, but in deciding whether they continue. That shift changes how control feels, because it moves it from something impossible, controlling what appears, to something practical, influencing what happens next. Over time, as this becomes more familiar, the relationship you have with your thoughts begins to change. They no longer feel like commands or signals that need to be acted on. They begin to feel more like events that pass through your awareness. You notice them, but you don't automatically follow them. You recognize their presence, but you don't treat them as instructions. And that creates space between the thought and your response. That space is subtle, but it changes the entire experience, because it removes the automatic link between a thought appearing and you engaging with it. And without that link, the thought loses some of its influence. It no longer controls your attention in the same way. It becomes something that can exist without pulling you in. And that shift, even when it's small, begins to weaken the pattern that made it feel like you had no control at all. This doesn't mean thoughts stop appearing. Your brain continues to generate them, just as it always has. But the way they are experienced changes. They become less dominant, less immediate, less compelling, because their power was never just in their appearance. It was in the automatic response that followed. The way they were immediately engaged with, expanded, and reinforced. When that response begins to change, the thoughts themselves begin to feel different, not because they are different in content, but because they are no longer being amplified in the same way. They rise and then they pass, without building into something larger, without taking over your attention completely. And that creates a different kind of mental state, one where thoughts are present, but not controlling. What this ultimately reveals is that control over your thoughts is not what it first appears to be. It's not about choosing what thoughts arise. That part of the process is automatic, shaped by patterns, memory, and prediction. The control exists in how those thoughts are treated once they appear, whether they are followed, questioned, expanded, or allowed to pass. And that distinction is what changes the experience of thinking, because it shows that you are not responsible for the appearance of every thought, but you are involved in what happens next. That involvement is subtle, but it is consistent. It exists in every moment a thought appears, and over time, it shapes how your mind behaves, not by controlling what is generated, but by influencing what is reinforced. And once that becomes clear, the idea of control begins to feel different. It's no longer about trying to manage every thought or prevent certain ones from appearing. It's about recognizing the process for what it is, a continuous generation of mental activity shaped by patterns you don't directly control, combined with a response that you do influence, even if only slightly at first, and in that understanding, something shifts. Thoughts still appear, but they don't carry the same authority. They don't feel like something you have to follow or believe automatically. They become something you can experience without being defined by, something that can exist without controlling your attention. And that change, even though it begins small, alters the entire way your mind feels over time.